Core is like the archbishop and pope in the Catholic Church. So it's like definitely the most popular version of that thing, but it's a version. People have different takes on what that thing should be, and ultimately, like that system is kind of like a bunch of, and all, I'm talking about the Bitcoin, core developers. I see them favorably, but you could see them as a bunch of like unelected weirdos who just want to do their thing. And whether or not you like that thing that they're doing, that's sort of up to you. And that doesn't necessarily define what Bitcoin is. If they go off in one direction that you feel is not what Bitcoin is supposed to be delivering on, then maybe that's no longer Bitcoin to you. Ultimately, there's a much simpler definition, which is it's a group of software developers who work on maintaining the most popular Bitcoin.
I'll invite maybe Casey or Psifour to expand on that. How would you, maybe not using a religious analogy, explain what Bitcoin Core is and Bitcoin consensus?
I mean, Bitcoin consensus is what the economic majority of nodes on the rules that the economic majority of nodes on the Bitcoin network enforce. So whatever clients they happen to be running, which these days are different versions of Bitcoin Core. Bitcoin Core is the software that sort of enforces, creates those rules, but ultimately Bitcoin consensus, it's sort of like stages, right? The Bitcoin developers produce Bitcoin Core, which is not itself Bitcoin consensus. Bitcoin consensus is a property of people running an actual Bitcoin node, which winds up being Bitcoin Core. So Bitcoin Core is sort of upstream of Bitcoin consensus. Bitcoin consensus is downstream of Bitcoin Core. It's the actual software that people run.
I like to say that typically we can use a Venn diagram. Here's Bitcoin Core, and a bigger circle around it is Bitcoin consensus. There's something in the water this past year because we've seen people extend things on top of Bitcoin for a long time, but it feels like it really kicked off this past year. What's going on? Max, Psifour, Jeremy, Casey, what's going on?
Some guy came along and released a meta protocol that happened to attract large numbers of eyes and a time period where Bitcoin was probably the most boring it had ever been for development. So you had this weird cascade where more people wanted to come in because fun stuff's being built, and more developers wanted to build fun stuff because more people were coming in. Previously, we hadn't really seen that. We had seen, developers leaving over the previous years due to fraudulent lawsuits, and a lot of these economic or social or even legal factors kind of tearing away at the fun of building on Bitcoin. And we kind of just needed a jump start. And again, Casey managed to be the guy who found the pull cord to get the motor running again.
For what it's worth, I'm actually deeply confused as to why ordinals and inscriptions was it. You can point to tons and tons and tons of different protocols that were built on Bitcoin. Counterparty, the Omni layer, right, which was the original vehicle for Tether, the largest stablecoin in the world. Oodles and oodles and oodles of different protocols and things on top of Bitcoin. I honestly don't exactly know why ordinals and inscriptions were what sort of kicked off Bitcoin season 2, yet here we are.
It seemed to me like everyone, the meta protocols in the old days kind of died off and everyone was like, well, that's boring. And then somebody finally kickstarted it again and everyone just jumped right back on the boat. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah,
Just doing my thing.
Part of it, Casey, talk about part of it may be due to its elegance and simplicity versus perhaps some of these other previous attempts like Mastercoin or Omni, which were more complex. Max, you mentioned that you might have a little bit of more insight to how those worked, and maybe do you know why those don't work? Maybe expand on that.
Yeah, so back in the old days, if anyone remembers what originally started as Mastercoin, people started looking at Bitcoin, they saw the limitations early on, and instead of trying to change their core protocol, and there were always people trying to do that, but they decided to just build this layer on top of Bitcoin and just put basically their own blockchain right inside of Bitcoin and just look at Bitcoin through a different lens to do something interesting with it. And it was a really exciting idea, but it ran into the scalability issues. Back then we didn't even have 4 megabyte blocks, we had 1 megabyte blocks. And so the whole that approach, it was really cool, it was really powerful, but it just ran into the scalability bottlenecks, and everyone kind of went off to Ethereum land when that launched. But there were great ideas in there, and I think the fact that we've resurrected those and kind of revisited the lessons of 5-6 years ago, and now we know those for working on these kinds of new meta protocols, I think super exciting.
If I had to pinpoint an exact reason and pick only one and make it small, it would be that Ordinals is, there's no opt-out. Everybody is doing it, and it's describing existing Bitcoin activity, whereas previously things, they were really opt-in. Yeah, you could do NFTs, but if you weren't doing NFTs, then it didn't really affect your coins. Whereas ordinal theory, it all of a sudden recategorized every preceding Bitcoin transaction, and now every Bitcoin user sort of like had to start thinking about this, in particularly because of like rarity of like, oh, well, do I want this one? Is this one good? Is it bad? And so I think that sort of made it go viral, so to speak.
Jeremy, you coined the term orb, ORB, ordinals, runes, and BitVM as this good catchphrase to talk about the new types of things happening on Bitcoin. I've heard a lot of people say, like, particularly like a lot of ossification people who would self-describe as ossification adjacent, like, okay, well, we can, if we want to do something on Bitcoin, we can just build it. We don't need to change the base layer. The market engineers will figure out how to do it. And it's funny because like I feel like all those same people are also then simultaneously criticizing Orb. But to me, it feels like these things are actually just us figuring out how to do a lot of the things that we want to on top of Bitcoin. It seems that what we see is these new extensions and ideas on top of Bitcoin are us and the market experimenting on this. Do you guys see this the same way, or how would you extend on what I'm talking about here?
I think what you're saying is sort of inevitable, is that a lot of Bitcoiners, and especially Bitcoin core developers, are really focused on aesthetic. I think of core developers as artisans rather than engineers. They're really focused on the quality of their craft, and maybe not necessarily other attributes of that. How pleasing is it that this is the way that I built this thing? And I think that because of that functionality that people wanted, and maybe they wanted it not in the most clean way, and they were asking for it really directly, it was, well, we're going to figure out a way to make it even shinier and even more rounded rectangles, and that kind of design fixation. And then it's sort of like this like eye of the needle of like very difficult to find. And once that was found, the functionality came out, and it came out awful. Like, ordinals suck, runes suck, BitVM sucks. They all suck, they're bad, they're not how you would do it. And so I think that's where there's a lot of hatred, is like, it's just not how you would do it, but now it's figured out that it could be done. And I think that makes aesthetic-driven people very unhappy.
Yeah, you have a bunch of engineers who have optimized a specific problem set. And to be very clear, they've done so very, very well. As much as I will rag on Bitcoin Core before anybody else, they have managed to keep a working client for as far back as you could possibly want to go in Bitcoin, barring, I believe, 2 breaks, where if you're trying to go through the versions for fun, you'll have a bad time. But then we present them with this whole new world of like, oh yeah, by the way, you've been thinking adversarially. You've been worrying about attackers of Bitcoin, but you haven't been thinking about those of us who are on Bitcoin are like, we're bringing the attacks with us, in quotes, of like, we want these things. We're going to realize that the pastry-shaped wheels, or the wheel-shaped pastries that you've been baking, are delicious, and we're going to call them donuts.
I feel like we've beaten this horse to death, but like, do any of these things actually break Bitcoin?
No, not at all. It's always funny. So back in the day, I did another project where we were accused of spamming Bitcoin. We were taking 30% of Bitcoin block space. And the reason is because nobody else wanted it. Nobody was paying for it. But everyone was sure that was going to break Bitcoin, and I think it's still running. So I think we're going to be okay.
I mean, I will say that I do take the threat of, some change to Bitcoin's capabilities, enabling specifically a Ethereum-style AMM, which could create miner centralizing MEV on Bitcoin. I do take that threat seriously. It's sort of a unknown unknown. For example, opcat is an extremely powerful opcode. Were somebody able to convincingly demonstrate that you could build a Ethereum-style AMM on Bitcoin, which would lead to miners being able to play all the transaction reordering games that they do on Ethereum to get excess revenue at the cost of centralization. I would take that seriously, but it's sort of in limbo at the moment. Like, we know that this is a very powerful construct. We know you can do a lot of powerful things. Can you build an Ethereum-style AMM with it? I don't know, but it is a risk.
I think part of that too is it is a risk, and there's risks to changing the core protocol, and what does that enable? But Bitcoin's already exposed to those risks anyway. If you look at L2s, the roll-up data that they're going to put into Bitcoin already gives Bitcoin miners an amount of control and the ability to extract MEV. And so I think we're kind of stuck with that. Maybe not directly.
Doesn't it depend on the characteristics of the rollup, like whether or not the miners actually can sequence those transactions?
It does, yeah, and it depends on the rollup design. But I think the fact of the Bitcoin protocol, you could design rollups that bring that existential risk to Bitcoin, right? And so we're already kind of exposed to it. So making a change to the Bitcoin protocol that allows it, we still got to be careful. But I think there's already a lot of that risk coming in from Bitcoin's current design anyway.
I think it's important that we always keep threat vectors in mind when we discuss like what we're building. Maybe there are ways that Bitcoin can be harmed, but one, Bitcoin is a machine that's designed to be attacked. Every time it is attacked, it either improves or we find out that it was resilient to that. On this specific topic, I would love to have a long form debate about it at some point, because I actually think the incentives are not where the centralizing forces are right now. If we look at Stacks, for instance, they had a MEV issue where you just exclude other bids for their proof of burn, and that allowed you to effectively hijack their network for short periods for rewards. But the only miner doing that was one of the least centralizing forces in mining, comparatively. So it's one of those, I think these are threats, but they also are opportunities for Bitcoin to grow.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do we evaluate these threats? You say the unknown unknowns, Casey. This is an ongoing conversation. Like, a lot of people say, well, we only just now figured out what Taproot can do. We can push JPEGs on
Anybody who says that is fucking retarded.
Yeah.
Like the Taproot upgrade, it's in black and white that it's literally like, yeah, there's no more limits to the script data. Anybody who was like caught by surprise by the fact that you can stick a lot of data in Taproot scripts is a fucking idiot, and you shouldn't take them seriously. It's like literally just there. It's not even like an unknown. It's like one very explicit like line in the documentation that says this limit is removed. Like, it's literally there. So no, they're real unknowns. That's a known. That's what that was. But yeah, no, it's complicated, right? Ethereum is like completely fucked with MEV. Like, it's basically just enshrined. Like, they can't get rid of it, right? And at some level of expressivity, Bitcoin becomes like Ethereum and people can build stuff like that. However, it is like an unknown argument. I don't know if you remember when, we built some like particle accelerator or whatever, the Large Hadron Collider or whatever it's called. And people were like, oh, this is the more energy than we've ever had. Maybe we're going to create a black hole that like rips open the fabric of the universe. That's sort of what the opcat argument is like. And obviously I'm making it seem kind of silly, but it's like something you have to kind of take seriously, but it is like an odd thing because it's like, yeah, are we opening up these capabilities from, beyond the grave or whatever?
Eat us. I know I'm mixing a metaphor there, but like there's a pretty decent chance if we don't see more stuff happening, Bitcoin just dies anyway.
No, the state is definitely the wolves. I'll throw a question back to you. You wanted me to ask about Bitcoin Pure. Yeah. Pure. Explain this to me, because I also intentionally asked you about the Bitcoin Core?
Yeah, so Bitcoin Pure is a client that I've started maintaining, and it's a slow start. It's not like I'm like out there being like, you got to run Bitcoin Pure. But I think starting at Bitcoin 0.27, I'm maintaining my own fork, and that's what I intend to run. And I think what's happened with Bitcoin Core is it's 10% Bitcoin node and 90% fluff. Fluff is still like useful stuff. People use that code all the time, but it's not really what's necessary to run a node. And I think it's also like if you want one of those 90% features, you now have to run, if you want one of those, say 90 features, you're now running 89 other things that you didn't need. And I think that a lot of those things can be unbundled and brought into separate software. And that's really where Bitcoin Core should be, is it should be very focused on consensus. If you're running a Bitcoin, if you're trying to run a consensus process to do an upgrade, you now have to make, let's say you change opcat, you redefine it or something, and you now have to go through all this like random wallet code, random network propagation code. And that's really not the responsibility of Bitcoin Core, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of people working on that type of stuff. And I think what that's led is a lack of focus on making the network as resilient as possible, because people who are operating as core developers are focused on like UX and libraries instead of focused on like actually making the client completely resilient. So I think Bitcoin Pure is an effort to, and it's a slow burn, but to make a minimal client based on Bitcoin Core, but not taking in a lot of pet projects and new changes.
What are some of the things that you're removing from Bitcoin Core?
So like the wallet, the GUI, there's a lot of like transaction indexes and things that I don't think are really necessary. Now, I know you're probably a user of some of that stuff, but ultimately like Bitcoin indexes should just be a separate service that you're running to get the index in the format you want. I think Ord is kind of more in that direction where you build out and maintain, and you're just calling a basic set of APIs on a Bitcoin Core node. And it turns out that the indexes or filters or things that Bitcoin Core makes aren't necessarily the way that if you're building your thing you would even want to do. And then whenever you go and say, oh, I want to run the new consensus version, now you're also taking in a lot of upgrades on unrelated indexes and things like that. It's breaking a ton of stuff. So the consensus side should just be a simple, have a very simple set of APIs, just like get a block and then serialize it over the network and do what you want with it. And then people who build their services, they can rely on a more stable set of indexes, filters, other application layer things.
Aaron gave me a couple minutes. So I guess the last question, keep it brief. Is there such a thing as someone who is an ossifier? Because every time I hear these people talk, they're like, well, we just don't want to change anything big on Bitcoin. We just want to only fix it if something breaks.
Ossifiers are probably by definition kind of fucked because like by definition they don't do anything,
So I would say we use it in the same way we use like political party affiliations. In that we say ossifier, we say accelerationist, when really none of us that are quote unquote accelerationists want Bitcoin to be Ethereum tomorrow. That'd obviously be insane. And none of the ossifiers want us to actually stop shipping code. They just want us to restrict, velocity of those changes. I say that there are probably people out there on both sides who do feel that extremely, and I'm happy to argue against them too. Anytime, catch me on Twitter. We'll have that discussion.
So I think a really important point is that people who want Bitcoin to stay the same, that's kind of a different way of saying ossifier, but it's really a different, that's maybe the underlying emotional need that people have. They want Bitcoin to stay the same. Bitcoin is like a bar. People come, people go, different crowds, and when it becomes popular, people come in and all of a sudden they're playing like games where they're like slamming drinks down, it's noisy, and you go, that's not fun. And they go, okay, well, we're gonna add private booths for people who wanna be noisy. And you go, it's just not gonna be the same. Well, you have to have changes because there's new behavior happening. And if you wanna maintain your current behavior without any change on how you are relying on Bitcoin, you do need new functionality to allow those new behaviors to lessen their impact on you. And so that's where things like opcat, I think, are interesting in maybe a bad way, because the type of covenants that they're enabling, it's going to like massively impact people. They're going to be like, oh, I can't do anything, and that's going to drive people to want more refined covenant opcodes. It's the same with like BitVM, and even the same with like runes and ordinals. Is like that activity happening makes people say, oh, well, maybe if we did these upgrades, we would not see as much Blockspace being used. So I think that that's going to be a driving force for changes for people who want Bitcoin to stay the same.
I like closing it with the analogy of a bar because it's a party. I feel we're all a little bit drunk right now. It's been a bull market. It's been really fun. Thank you guys so much for joining me up here. Max, Casey, Jeremy, Psifour. Everybody give them a hand.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.